Story 1. Barefoot Mystery. Prepare yourself for true terror. I'm about to tell you something, and I'm not even sure if this is the right place for a story like this, but I have no other outlet. I've shared it with everyone under the sun, my family, my neighbors, my friends, even random media outlets. It never seems to be enough. I can't quite put it into words, but I feel a strange duty to let as many people as possible know what's been happening to me. So, here it goes. It is November 2019 as I write these words, although the events began long ago. I'm talking more than 7 years back. I can't recall the exact year offhand, but let's say 2012. It might have been 2013, but that's my best guess. I was in my mid-20s, had a steady job, and a girlfriend who is now my fiancée. I never attended college, so I had been working for some time, and nothing in my life seemed poised for a sudden upheaval. There was no reason for me to move far from home, so I stayed there at that age. My girlfriend and I had just moved into my childhood home that my parents kindly passed along to me as my first house. It is an extremely old brick house that my dad inherited from his parents when he was about 40, so I was keeping it in the family. Although the house has undergone several rounds of renovations, its age is still obvious. It's the brickwork that gives it away. Brick houses are rare in our area, so it really stands out. I actually kind of like that, it makes it feel special. Speaking of our area, we live in a very wooded neighborhood, so the houses are spaced out. Our house is also the last lot on our street, so instead of sharing a border with the woods on one side, we have them on both sides. The woods behind us are enormous, and I mean truly enormous. As a kid, my brothers and I would often explore them, but no amount of wandering ever allowed us to map the whole area. I'm sure some people would find that intimidating, but I've always enjoyed the wild, so it never bothered me. Plus, I'm a guy who likes to stay busy, so being isolated in my own little corner of the world was appealing. My girlfriend and I had been living there for a few months when all this started. It was sometime during the winter, I can't recall the exact month, only that there was snow on the ground. It was just after 8 in the morning on a Sunday, the one day a week I could sleep in, when I climbed into my pickup truck to treat myself to coffee, as I do every Sunday morning. I noticed something strange in the driveway right next to my car, a trail of footprints in the snow. My first thought was that my girlfriend had somehow gotten up before me without my noticing and had stepped outside into the driveway for some reason. But the more I looked, the more I realized that wasn't possible. The trail led across my front yard and through a gap in our side fence, meaning the footprints originated from somewhere in the woods. Moreover, the trail didn't go anywhere near our house, so they couldn't have been made by my girlfriend. I remember standing there utterly confused because the trail didn't circle our house or approach any of the windows, only the driver's side door of my car. That meant someone had walked straight from the woods to my car and then immediately turned back into the woods. It was bizarre. I ended up asking my girlfriend about it later that day, but clearly she wasn't responsible. I wish I could share more details about that first incident, but it happened so long ago that that's about all I remember. It must have been at least 2 winters later when the next strange event occurred. I specifically recall it being 2015 because that was the year my Seahawks lost the Super Bowl to Tom Brady. I woke up that morning and walked to my car. I think it was a weekday, though I'm not completely sure. As soon as I stepped outside, I immediately sensed something was very, very wrong. There were footprints everywhere, in the driveway, near all the windows along the house's perimeter. The yard was completely covered in them. I'm usually level-headed, so I won't say I panicked, but I won't lie when I say I wasn't completely calm either. I was already late for work, so I didn't have time to examine the prints very closely, but I didn't want to leave my girlfriend in a potentially dangerous situation. I quickly ran around the house and yard to make sure no one was lurking on the property, but that was all I could do in the limited time I had. As I pulled out of the driveway, I texted my girlfriend about the situation so she wouldn't freak out. I ended up leaving work early that day, mostly because the situation kept replaying in my mind. By the time I got home, my girlfriend had made some shocking discoveries. As soon as I arrived, she waved me into the yard and pointed at one of the trails, saying it had been bothering her all day. At first, I was confused, but then I realized what she meant. None of the footprints showed any shoe prints. I felt foolish for not noticing sooner. Whoever had left the prints had been walking barefoot. I was speechless. Who in the world would wander around barefoot in freezing temperatures? My girlfriend suggested it might have been an animal, but the prints looked exactly like human footprints. We went inside and called my dad, but he said he had never experienced anything like that in all his years living in that house. He told me to grab my rifle and try to track down whoever left the footprints. I really didn't want to, but I knew it was my responsibility. My girlfriend wanted to call the police, but I knew that would be pointless. We had no proof of a crime, and I didn't think trespassing would trigger a search. I told her I would call the police if I found something in the woods, and she agreed. As I mentioned before, those woods are like another world, so I promised myself I'd head back as soon as the sun began to set. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and set off. I must have followed the trail for about 30 minutes when I saw something very strange. Out of nowhere, the trail split into two separate paths. I had no idea which one to follow. Hell, I didn't even think that was possible. I thought maybe whoever left the trail had doubled back to confuse me, but then a scarier thought hit me. Could there be more than one person out there? I had assumed I was tracking a single person the whole time. The idea of multiple people never even crossed my mind. That possibility shook me, though I wasn't entirely comfortable knowing I might be outnumbered. I stood there for a little while longer before deciding to turn back since it was getting dark anyway. As I walked back, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. I felt sure I would have noticed if two people were following in the same prints. There's no way the person behind could have done it without leaving a mistake. Then I wondered if perhaps someone had walked backward from deeper in the woods to make it seem like there were two people all along. And then, of course, there was the possibility that it was just one person who had doubled back on themselves. Maybe someone had even been carrying another person and then got tired. I really didn't know which explanation was the most disturbing. We eventually called the police that night, but as I expected, they told us there wasn't much they could do without solid evidence of a crime. I told my girlfriend I'd head back into the woods the next morning, but that night it snowed so heavily that no prints could be followed. My girlfriend was clearly terrified, but there was nothing we could do. Fortunately, that was the last incident that winter. In fact, nothing happened for a few years after that. I might even say we had completely forgotten about the whole ordeal. A lot had happened since then. My girlfriend and I got engaged and we were focused on other things. I wouldn't be writing this if the story ended there, though, because what I'm about to tell you happened less than a year ago. It was just after the new year, so in January of this year, one ordinary morning, I woke up to see footprints all over my property, just like before. All the memories came rushing back, and my fiancée even broke down in our bedroom, asking if we would ever escape this nightmare. I didn't know what to say. This time it was even worse. There were footprints leading to my shed, and a bunch of tools were missing. No one could guess what else those intruders might have done. I was furious, so I called my friend Theo, explained the situation, and asked him to help me out. He's a big fan of the wilderness and a much more experienced hunter than I am, which was partly why I asked for his help. He agreed and drove over to my place a few hours later. My fiancée was extremely worried, but I promised her that Theo and I would handle it. We dressed warmly and geared up, knowing we might be out there for hours. The one thing that kept me from being completely scared this time was that Theo had a really expensive thermal scope for his AR-10, which would help us see in low light. I had never spent that kind of money on hunting gear, so I'd still be in the dark, but it was comforting to know at least one of us could see. I won't sugarcoat it, I was pretty scared when we first set out. Theo and I talked as we walked, but after 45 minutes, we mostly fell silent. It felt as if the gravity of the situation had finally hit both of us at once. I remember praying that I hadn't dragged Theo into something terrible. I'm not sure how long we walked after that, but eventually the trail split again into two sets of footprints. We followed the left set for a few minutes, but at one point the trail abruptly ended. We retraced our steps back to the split, and Theo remarked that whoever had left the tracks clearly did not want to be followed. I didn't want to think about it, so we just continued following the prints in silence. I'm not exaggerating when I say there were at least 3 other dead ends that forced us to backtrack, wasting precious daylight. I remember thinking it was remarkable that someone could walk backwards so flawlessly that the trail didn't show signs of repeated steps, it just wasn't normal. The one silver lining, as Theo pointed out, was that the dead ends probably meant we were tracking just one person. Eventually, it started getting dark, and we were deep in the woods by that point. I couldn't recognize my surroundings at all. The trail didn't split again for a long while, and then Theo said that whoever we were tracking had probably given up trying to create dead ends. About 5 minutes later, the footprints started looking much deeper. We must have been close. At one point, another set of footprints appeared alongside the original ones, and Theo swore, whispering that he had been wrong and that we were likely following 2 people. By now the sun was completely down, so Theo kept checking his scope every so often while I used the snow's reflection for some visibility. I'll be honest, I probably would have turned back if it weren't for Theo's scope. We were walking in total silence when suddenly I felt Theo's arm push against my chest, signaling for me to stop. I looked at him, and he was staring straight ahead through his scope. I couldn't see what he was looking at, so I just kept watching him. It looked like he was holding his breath. I had never seen him so still before. After about 20 seconds, he slowly moved toward the nearest tree and crouched down. I followed his lead without questioning why he looked through his scope again, and I saw his hand begin to tremble slightly. Another 20 seconds of complete silence passed, and I was practically screaming inside from suspense, so I lightly tapped his shoulder. He lowered his rifle silently and handed it over to me. When I looked through the scope, I had to fight back a scream. There were 4 figures huddled in the snow. At first, I thought they were bears, but I quickly realized they were human. 2 of them were large and hunched over, while the other 2 were small. The smaller ones clung to a nearby tree, turning their heads around wildly as they ate something I couldn't clearly make out. I couldn't see faces or details because thermal scopes don't give that much clarity, but I could tell they were naked. It was the most terrifying sight I have ever seen with my own eyes. Eventually, the larger figures lifted the smaller ones from the tree and placed them on their shoulders, then began walking deeper into the woods. I sat under that tree for what felt like an hour, not daring to move until I was sure they couldn't hear us. When we finally returned to the house hours later, I was surprised to find my fiancée still awake. She told me she couldn't sleep knowing I was out there and asked what we had seen. I described it in as few details as possible, but she was still horrified. That night, we called the police, who promised to search the woods. The next morning, Theo agreed to stay overnight so that the 2 of us could help the police search. The officers combed the woods with our help but eventually called it off after a few hours due to the partly obscured footprints. My fiancé demanded that they continue searching, but they said they couldn't launch a huge investigation over some missing tools. I don't blame them, but it didn't feel like we got any closure. Theo and I both knew what we had seen. With winter quickly approaching, both my fiancé and I are worried those people will return. We are seriously considering moving, but we haven't managed to set the plan in motion yet. I really don't know what to think. As I mentioned earlier, I've told everyone I can about what's been happening to us. It's been going on for years. None of my neighbors have ever experienced anything like this, which makes no sense to me. I have no idea why my house is being targeted or what those people even want. Some of my friends think they are harmless, but others warn me that I'm in grave danger. I'm considering sealing off my yard from the woods, but I'm not sure what else to do besides that. Hopefully, we can move out soon. Story 2. Trail Shadows. Last summer, I decided to take on a major section of the Pacific Crest Trail. I have always loved hiking, especially taking trips on my own. My plan was simple: park my car at the end of the trail, catch a ride to the trailhead, and then hike back over the course of just over a week and a half. It sounded straightforward enough at the time. The first few days went smoothly. The trail was just as I'd hoped, endless stretches of tall trees and winding paths through peaceful landscapes. I'm in pretty good shape, so I didn't need to take many breaks while hiking. Naturally, I wouldn't be hiking in the dark, so every night I had to set up a tent to get some sleep. I've always preferred to stay under the radar, especially since solo hikers can draw attention. Because of that, I would venture a bit off the main trail each night to set up my camp. I figured that was the best way to minimize the chance of someone stumbling upon my campsite. Up until the third night, everything went perfectly. But what I'm about to share is the reason I'm now taking a long break from hiking or any form of wilderness adventure. I woke up in the middle of the night with an odd feeling that something was wrong. It was that kind of gut feeling you just can't ignore. I looked around my tent and everything seemed normal inside, so I decided to check the area around the campsite. I grabbed my rifle, took a flashlight, and unzipped the tent. There was no one outside, no one in sight. At least, that's what I thought until I went back to check my pack and realized my wallet was missing. At first, I assumed I'd just misplaced it, maybe I had left it outside the tent or it was hidden somewhere in my gear. But after rummaging through everything, it was clear that someone had taken it: my personal ID, cash, credit cards, all of it. How could that be possible? Had someone broken into my tent just to steal that one thing and then left? That seemed unlikely, and randomly misplacing it was completely unlike me. I came to the grim conclusion that I had probably lost it. Then, things got even worse over the next few days. I began noticing more small items missing, random things like one of my lighters, my Swiss Army knife, and even a few energy bars. I knew I wasn't simply misplacing everything, someone was taking my stuff. Part of me didn't want to believe it, but by the fourth day, it was undeniable: I was being stalked. There was no cell signal in that part of the trail, so I couldn't call anyone for help about my situation. I remember thinking about turning back, but that would only save me a couple of days at best. There was no way I could hike in either direction without having a place to sleep, and I didn't feel safe pitching a tent in those woods knowing someone was following me. It was a total lose-lose situation. I remained calm and told myself that there was a reason I had brought my rifle along. Then it hit me: why hadn't that person taken my gun? It was almost as if they were deliberately toying with me. That night, I zipped my tent shut from the inside, hoping it would keep them out if they returned. I tried to stay awake as long as I could, but eventually I fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. My plan worked, though, because when I woke up the next morning, there was no sign that anyone had been in my tent. However, the paranoia set in completely. The isolation was getting to me, and every moment on the trail was agonizing. I don't suffer from anxiety normally, but I can honestly say I have never felt worse in my life than I did over the next few days. Just imagine being in my shoes, with no option but to keep hiking even though you know someone is lurking just behind you. The anxiety was constant, and I started to unravel. I can't explain why or how, but my mind began playing tricks on me. A rustling in the bushes turned out to be nothing, and a shadow at the edge of my vision disappeared as soon as I looked directly at it. The hallucinations only got worse. I can remember many of them, but the one that stands out the most is when, as I was walking, I stepped into an ankle-deep puddle that almost made me trip. I literally heard a splash and felt cold water soaking my sock, but when I looked down, the ground was completely dry. I stood there in utter shock. It felt so real that I had no choice but to continue down the trail. As tough as the days were, the nights were even worse. I would zip my tent shut and sleep next to my rifle, but nothing seemed to ease the anxiety. At one point, I had to splash cold water on my face just to calm myself down. After that, the hallucinations mostly faded, and I don't know what I would have done if they had persisted. The next night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps circling my campsite. I quietly grabbed my rifle, preparing to confront whoever was there, but my body was frozen with fear. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods, but there was no way I was going back to sleep after that. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up camp in a rush, my hand trembling so badly I could hardly secure my gear. I knew I couldn't stay another night out there. I was roughly a day and a half's hike away from my car, maybe less if I moved quickly. I decided I wouldn't stop to sleep that night. I'd push through the darkness and leave the cursed trail as soon as possible. I hiked as fast as my body would allow for hours. When the sun began to set, I gritted my teeth and kept going instead of stopping to pitch my tent. By the time I managed to set up a tent in the dark, I was probably only about 2 hours away from safety. I kept moving with a flashlight in one hand and my rifle in the other. I started second-guessing my decision. I'd never hiked in the dark before and wasn't ready for the challenge, which was scary enough on its own. After about an hour, I began to get closer, and then I heard it, somewhere behind me. I was sure I heard footsteps. I spun around, flashed my light, and to my horror, saw a figure slinking behind a tree. Adrenaline took over, and I aimed my rifle at the tree, shouting for them to come out. The figure stepped forward. It was definitely human, but I can't describe how barbaric he looked. I'm not exaggerating, words can't capture what I was seeing. He was wearing nothing except a pair of my shorts, which I hadn't even realized were missing. His skin was covered in scratches in several spots, and his face was all hairy. He started walking toward me even though my rifle was aimed right at him. Before I could react further, I tapped off a warning round near him. He jumped at the sound and instantly retreated, sprinting back into the woods. I was in shock. Without wasting another second, I turned around and ran as fast as I could. By the time I made it out of the woods, I locked my car doors and called the police. When they finally arrived, they told me I shouldn't stick around, and I didn't need to be told twice. I left that night. The craziest part of the whole ordeal, in my opinion, was the hallucinations. I never thought they could be so vivid. It's going to be a long time before I go hiking again, and I can say for sure that next time I won't be alone. I would advise anyone planning to hike the Pacific Crest Trail to be extremely cautious and carry a firearm. This experience is something I still think about often. Story 3. Logger's Curse. I apologize in advance if I mix up any details in the story I'm about to share. This is something my best friend told me several times over the years. It's one of those unsettling tales that sticks with you even after hearing it repeatedly. My friend's dad was a logger, specifically, a chainsaw operator. For those who aren't familiar with one, a huge machine capable of felling giant trees and cutting them into set lengths. His job meant long, grueling hours, often spent alone in the deep, secluded forests of the Pacific Northwest. The way his logging crew worked was such that he got paid based on how many trees he cut down rather than the hours he worked, so he often pushed himself to work 16 to 20-hour days to finish jobs quickly. After he and his co-worker finished their part, the rest of the crew would come in to clear the felled trees and transport them to the mill. While he spent about half of his time working by himself, the other half was spent with his friend Griffin, another chainsaw operator. They used radios to communicate, especially when they were working on opposite ends of the same site. Years ago, my friend's dad and Griffin were sent to a remote job site high up on a mountain. It took the company over 3 weeks just to clear a road wide enough for their trucks and equipment to reach the site. By the time they began working, they were positioned in a very desolate area of the mountain. They had already been there for 10 days and were making good progress when they started hearing strange chatter over their radios. At first, the voices were muffled, just faint, static-laden murmurs that didn't make any sense. They tried switching channels, but no matter what they did, the chatter continued to follow them. Anyone who has used a standard radio knows how odd it is to be followed when you switch channels. As they moved farther up the mountain, the voices became clearer. They couldn't make out full conversations, but from what they heard, they both agreed that the tone of these fragments felt off. My friend's dad said the voices sometimes sounded almost casual, yet the content was unintelligible. They also began finding odd signs that someone had been there before, random containers, footprints in the dirt, and small, makeshift campsites. Remember, they were in a place so remote it was almost inaccessible, so finding these signs was deeply unsettling. No one should have been up there. One day, Griffin came across a tent hidden just off a trail and called my friend's dad over. They decided to investigate inside. They found a single sleeping bag and a duffel bag filled with the most disturbing items imaginable, multiple pairs of children's underwear, duct tape, rope, and crude sketches depicting the abuse of children. There were even photos of a fresh apple, suggesting that whoever owned it had been there recently. Griffin wanted to pack up and leave immediately. But my friend's dad, ever the workaholic, insisted they finish the job. They agreed to restrict their radio communication to emergencies only and decided to keep working that night. They sat in the camper, unable to shake the dreadful feeling that hung over them. Then the radio crackled to life again, and this time they could make out snippets of a conversation between two men. They were talking about mundane things like collecting water and firewood, but the thought that these men were likely connected to the tent really freaked my friend's dad out. Griffin wasn't as affected, but my friend's dad was beginning to lose it. The next night, he decided to confront them when he heard the men discussing gathering brush for a fire. He grabbed the radio and demanded to know who they were and what they were doing there. Immediately, the radio went silent and the men did not respond. That silence was almost more unsettling than the earlier chatter. Griffin was upset that my friend's dad had announced their presence, and the two of them got into a brief argument before deciding to escalate the situation the next day. Around midnight the following day, Griffin shook my friend's dad awake, whispering that someone was outside the camper. The first thing he heard was the soft sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside, a hard, pounding sound. He fumbled for his gun, only to realize it wasn't loaded. He had no idea where his ammunition was. Griffin was unarmed, and given their remote location, the idea of calling the police was laughable. They both sat frozen as they heard the camper door handle jiggle. The door creaked open but didn't swing fully inward. Their camper was raised high off the ground and had no ladder or stool to climb up. Then came deliberate, long scratches along the outside of the door. For agonizing minutes passed, and finally, my friend's dad nodded at Griffin, signaling that he was going to check it out. He moved quietly toward the door, clutching a flashlight in his trembling hand. Just as he reached the door, it burst open, and he was struck across the face with a knife. The pain was blinding. He fell out of the camper hard before he could recover. A man was already on top of him, pressing the knife against his neck. Another man appeared and started kicking him repeatedly in the head. Without hesitation, Griffin leaped out of the camper and tackled the man with the knife. The second man bolted into the darkness, and the one Griffin had tackled scrambled to his feet and ran after him, disappearing into the forest. Griffin helped my friend's dad back into the truck, and they drove for 2 hours to the nearest hospital. It was serious. His face was a bloody mess, and a deep cut across his eyes permanently damaged his vision. They reported the attack to the police, but nothing came of it. 2 weeks later, as the rest of the logging crew finished the job, one of their coworkers was found bound, gagged, raped, and murdered in a ditch. No arrests were ever made to this day. My friend's dad still struggles with PTSD, and his right eye, with its oddly shaped pupil, constantly reminds him of that night. I'm sure he hasn't had a single night of good sleep since. I have been deeply afraid of the woods for a long time now, mostly because of my friend's dad's experience. I haven't heard from my friend or his dad in years, so I can only hope he is doing all right.